Someone tried to shoot Donald Trump.
Take a look what happened.
Absolutely astonishing scenes there from America over the weekend. And frankly, the world left wondering, how has our politics come to this?
The US presidential hopeful is going to be in Milwaukee on Thursday, where he hopes to deliver a different kind of speech in reaction to what happened in Pennsylvania, Kamal. But will those extraordinary events come to define the next US election?
We'll be joined by our US editor, Tony Diver.
And, sadly, it isn't coming home.
Gareth Southgate had said he wanted to win this so much that it hurt. He certainly feels anguish now. England players down on their haunches in desolation at the end.
And we'll be asking what next for Gareth Southgate. And, of course, his knitwear.
I'll buy it off him.
Welcome to the Daily Tea with me, Camilla Tominey.
And me, Kamal Ahmed. Olly Brown joins us. Olly, are you still in Berlin? Are you planning your flights home? Are you in a slightly austere hotel room there behind you?
Slightly glary in the background, but no, I'm flying back tomorrow actually, because I had no idea how today was going to unfold, whether it was going to be this day of jubilation with bank holiday announced and parade in London tomorrow. So kind of everything was plans were in suspension, really.
What could have been, Olly? What could have been?
Exactly, yeah. Now there's just this grim finality.
Tell us, obviously, you've given us some beautiful sound there of what the day felt like, but the day after, what went wrong now you're looking back?
Quite a lot, really. I mean, it's a brutal reckoning for Gareth Southgate. England are now the first country in the 64 years of the European Championship to have lost back-to-back finals, and this one, in many ways, I thought was quite difficult to excuse. I thought for long stretches of that match last night, it was as if these players were letting the game of their lives pass them by. I felt quite powerfully at kickoff. There was the anticipation was extraordinary to feel. Really, you felt that it had to be there and it had to be at that moment, because to have this chance again 3 years after they spurned the first one, it almost never happens in international football, where knockout games are decided on such fine margins. And I didn't feel that England grasped it with the intent that they needed to. They were just outplayed in every department. And as easy as it is to say that they were just outclassed by Spain and that Spain are untouchable, this wasn't the Spain team that won 3 major trophies from 2008 to 2012. This was a Spain team with some limitations. I mean, especially in defence, and given the plethora of attacking options that England had, I didn't think either in the final or really much during the tournament that they delivered what they were capable of.
Olly, can you square that circle then? Because we appreciate that armchair critics are irritating, Kamal. We've all had our opinion on Gareth Southgate.
I could manage the England team. I know I could manage the England team.
Exactly. We've all had our conversations, haven't we, about the selections. We've discussed the fact that on paper, some of these players, we're used to them being absolutely extraordinary in the Premier League. So we have these great expectations. But maybe it's just too much. Olly, is it the psychology of it? Is there something wrong with the management there? I mean, I know you've said in your piece of audio earlier, there's now question marks over Gareth Southgate's future. What's your analysis of why this team of champions cannot be a champion team?
Well, it's a good question, and I think the answer's twofold, really. It seemed at times last night that the players wanted this almost too much. I thought a player such as Kobbie Mainoo, only 19 years old, seemed faintly overawed by it, in all honesty. And I also am not convinced that Gareth Southgate has the pedigree to win games such as this. The Spanish are just past masters at winning finals. I mean, there's an astonishing statistic that Spain and Spanish club sides have beaten foreign opponents in 27 consecutive finals now.
Wow.
And England just don't seem to have that know-how. And it seemed really as if Southgate in the build-up to all this was trading on vibes and emotional energy and screaming one more. And when it came down to it, didn't really seem to have a coherent tactical plan as to how he was going to take on Spain. I mean, England didn't have a shot on target until first half injury time. I mean, in a game of that magnitude, that's just unforgivable. Everybody knew they weren't going to see a great deal of the ball, but when they did have it, they created precious little. And I think they'll be racked with regret.
Ollie, what's going to happen now, do you think, for Gareth Southgate? After the World Cup in Qatar, he took quite a period of time off, didn't he, with his family? I think, over a week before he spoke again publicly. Is that sustainable for him now? Obviously, we've got different people with different opinions about whether he should go. We've got Gary Lineker saying that he should. We've got our own columnist and obviously brilliant international and former Liverpool defender Jamie Carragher saying, no, he should stay. What's your judgment on what will happen next and whether he will go?
Well, I think the decision is entirely his own. I don't think the FA will get rid of him. I don't really think that they have, in all honesty, the gumption to do so. That they have been quite, it might sound a slightly brutal analysis, but they are very content with Southgate as the consummate company man.
That's
if you
the
like.
part of the problem, isn't it, Ollie? That kind of slight mediocrity, men in blazers or women in blazers sort of making judgments here. Isn't that part of our problem?
I think I do believe so, and Southgate has been a very convenient fit, and we should acknowledge he has done significant work. I mean, when he took over, England had just crashed out of the Euros to Iceland, and he's done a lot since then to rehabilitate the image of this England team and reconnect with the public. But I think after a while, when the results have been as they have, and obviously there's been great progress, but always agony right at the end of these tournaments, people grow slightly weary of the soft soap. He's improved the culture, and it's all the talk is all very kind of corporate and managerial, and I think it's really just reached the point now where people want to see whatever this grand plan is brought to fruition. And I just think his inherent limitations mean that are a crucial part of why England keep falling short.
What this keeps on reminding me of, Ollie, is this kind of suggestion that the British are just too nice and polite. Let's talk about Harry Kane, the England captain. He's clearly very tired. There's been talk of him having a back injury. He has had a very long season at Bayern Munich. Southgate keeps him in the starting lineup, starts with him despite that awesome goal by Ollie Watkins. I mean, again, is that just Southgate being polite rather than having that killer cutting edge? I've written here, why wasn't Kane able? Which Kamal thought was the corniest thing I've ever.
No, I thought it was the best line in the script. Camilla, I'm glad you've used it. I was sort of pointing at it, hoping that you would use this great line.
But what's gone on there? He shouldn't probably have started.
Well, Southgate's always been intensely loyal to his favourites. I mean, there were players such as Jordan Henderson and Harry Maguire before they got dropped from this squad, and Kane has been almost a non-negotiable. He is, after all, England's record goal scorer, but he looked nothing like it at any stage of this tournament, clearly half fit. I mean, this is somebody who'd scored 44 goals in his first season in Germany, but he just looked miles off it. And I think a really sharp manager would have diagnosed the problem quicker than Southgate did. I mean, people were praising him initially last night for taking Kane off after an hour, but it would have been more courageous to take him off at half time, and better still not to have started him at all when considering the euphoria at Ollie Watkins's goal 4 days earlier, that he did have plenty of options there, and somebody like Cole Palmer completely nerveless in the way he took his goal, and for 61 minutes, England just toiled and laboured with Kane. And within 3 minutes, they conjured the equaliser through Palmer. So it just showed to me yet again that Southgate was just too late in making the critical decision.
Imagine a parallel universe where the likes of Palmer and Watkins and Gordon and Tony did start instead of some of the old favourites, and what kind of tournament it might have been. I mean, sorry to think like that, but it's hard not to think like that.
Yes, the whole parallel universe would have been possibly wonderful. I think we should challenge Camilla. It is the men's team who have failed here. Of course, the women's team won the Euros under Serena Wiegmann. I was also thinking, if you think about cycling brilliance and how that was all changed in the way we approached professional cycling, David Brailsford famously now gone to Man United, and then the London Olympics. How many goals we won at the London Olympics by putting in place proper academy systems, proper identification of great talent, being brutal. I think you're absolutely right. In the men's game for the national team for England, it appears to be something about loyalty trumping skill. And there was a brutality. I remember the controversies over the lead into the London Olympics that good British athletes didn't make it.
Yeah.
But the point was, no, you have to be elite.
You have to be good enough.
You have to perform, and you have to be able to win gold. There's something there. Now, I'm not sure Keir Starmer has done the right thing here politically because it's only the day after, but he has made the point, overnight that something needs to be done in the men's game because the women have been much more successful on the England national, on the world stage for the England national team. Something needs to be done in the men's game from the academies, rewarding excellence. I know there is a brutality to the academy system already, but somehow it's not producing the right kind of England team to win tournaments.
Yeah, I think England, the Lionesses made quite a striking move by going for Serena Wiegmann, in that she was seen to be the best available in the world at that time. And I'm hearing suggestions now that the men's team should go all out in trying to tempt Jurgen Klopp out of retirement, considering that he seems to be the best choice out there. I don't go along with a view that I know is held by a lot of my colleagues that the England manager needs to be English, and that therefore any England triumph under a foreign coach would be kind of seen as in some way tempered. I was at the final at Wembley when the Lionesses won, and I doubt that any of the little girls who saw that were that their euphoria was mitigated in any way by the fact that the coaching team happened to be Dutch. I think you go for whatever is the optimum solution, and I mean England do have some homegrown options in Graham Potter, Eddie Howe, but whether that would make represent a massive leap from Southgate, I'm not convinced. But you look at somebody of the standard of Jurgen Klopp and the inspiration that he is able to impart, the way he can change games when they're ebbing away from his team. Those are gifts that I was never convinced that Southgate possessed, and I personally believe that's the path the FA should pursue.
Just a quick word, Ollie. I mean, I don't want to dwell on this too much because it overshadows all of those thousands of fans who go to Berlin in the best of spirits and behave impeccably and have great relationships with the other fans in the stadium. But we have been reporting on the Telegraph about members of the England Supporters Travel Club sharing horror stories from Sunday night's game in Berlin. The group's official Facebook page, again, posting videos people saying they're done watching the national team as a result. Some hooligans behaving extremely badly abroad, Ollie.
There's violence in London as well. I think in southern Spain as well, Benidorm and places, there is images of England fans fighting, and really brutal stuff, Ollie.
Yeah, it's a grisly echo, really, of the scenes we saw in 2021. Everyone I knew was arriving at the stadium extremely early last night because they feared being caught up in the same scenes that we encountered at Wembley, which was like something out of Dante's Inferno, and people kind of hanging 20 feet off traffic lights and trying to storm the ground. I mean, mercifully, the German police kept a lid on all that, largely in the build-up and during the game. But there was a mass release of frustration among fans last night, I feel, and it's a real shame that some of them have clearly behaved horrendously, because I think actually that they've had a better tournament image-wise than many were expecting. I know that people fear that there would be all kinds of nasty skirmishes, especially given some of the opponents, such as Serbia, that they were drawn against, that there could be clashes of various firms. That didn't materialise. But yeah, I mean, some of the scenes we've been reporting on this morning, totally inexcusable.
Thank you very much indeed, Ollie.
Thanks, Ollie. Let's look forward to Jurgen Klopp and 2026. I don't think we can. Not sure we can afford him, Ollie. But anyway, let's maybe give it a go.
And safe journey back from Berlin. Lovely to speak to you.
Oh, thanks, Camilla. Thanks, Kamal.
Thank you.
This whole new language of politics as an existential fight, polarisation of positions, constant language of war. From Republican supporters, I know criticisms of the Democrats. I mean, to me, less from the Democrat side, but frankly from all sides. We've got commentators, this idea of almost armed combatants. Put that all together with, a society where there are, easy availability of guns, the horrors of social media and how it weaponizes clips. It's a really toxic mix. And Donald Trump saying to the New York Post, which is really astonishing to think, 1 inch of difference in that bullet trajectory, Donald Trump telling the New York Post, I am supposed to be dead.
On one hand, we look at the history of the US, and assassinations aren't new. I mean, the JFK, well, let's begin with Lincoln, actually. JFK, his brother Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, attempts on Ronald Reagan. I mean, the list goes on. But having said that, when something like that actually happens to a human being, regardless of their political persuasion or indeed some of the controversial or otherwise things they may have said in the past, it's just so shocking. And how easily we let history roll over actually some of the political violence that we've witnessed in this country. We talk about Jo Cox and her murder, and rightly so. Somebody reminded me today that if he was still alive, David Amess, the Tory MP that was brutally stabbed to death in his own constituency surgery several years ago, if he was still alive, he would have been Father of the House under the new Starmer government because he was such a long-serving politician. We forget that a Labour MP, Stephen Timms, was nearly stabbed to death back in 2010, I think it was. So we've had 2 murders and 1 attempted murder of our own politicians in this country in the last 15 years.
There's certainly been an echo across the Atlantic here in some of the discourse, and we need to take care. As you say, we forget history too easily, and that language matters. There's a fascinating piece by Frank Luntz, who wrote for The Telegraph, the famous American pollster, who has just laid out some of that American division. He said that in America, 80% of people say they are now more divided than ever before. They say that America is seriously off the right track. Again, 80% of people saying that. Trust is at historic lows. They're pessimistic. They feel there's polarization. There's obviously been discussion about the effect on the presidential race. His point, though, is that people still feel wholly committed to one side or the other. He said that only 4% of people were truly undecided about the presidential election race. So he claimed or said that there was no one to move. So to talk about all those effects, that polarization, what is happening in America, Tony Diver, our US editor, welcome back to the Daily Tea. Wonderful stuff you did with us last week. It's so good to have you back on the podcast. Tony, just take us, what's the weekend felt like? You've been reporting, obviously, ever since the attack on the president.
Well, on Saturday night, we had a Donald Trump rally in Pennsylvania. Donald Trump gives a lot of rallies. We don't always go to them. He's often out speaking to voters in swing states, and Pennsylvania is one of those. So I was just following it along on TV. I was watching from home. There was a possibility he might announce his vice presidential candidate. So it was of some news interest. And suddenly, that moment that everyone will have now seen, when shots could be heard in the background, Trump himself dives to the floor, grabs his ear, and complete chaos ensues as people were trying to work out what was going on. The immediate thought, of course, was that we were seeing a rerun of history and that the president had been shot on stage and that he'd been killed. But he was then ushered from the stage. It was clear that he was still standing. And there was then a kind of few hours of confusion about what exactly had happened. That has triggered an avalanche of sort of political fallout in the US as everyone on all sides tries to work out what all of this means. For some people, especially for the Trump people, it means that a shift in strategy, a change to talking about national unity and about responding to this attack. For President Biden, it means extending an olive branch and a hand of friendship to his biggest political rival, Donald Trump, to say, I'm sorry that you've been attacked in this way, and to offer some support. It also raises significant questions about security that's offered to these kinds of people, to former presidents on stage. And it opens up other questions about why exactly this attack was carried out and what was behind it. So there's a lot of questions still being asked a couple of days on. And we're now heading into the Republican convention this week. I'm in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where we're going to be seeing Trump and a lot of those Republicans on stage talking about their agenda for a next presidential term. So the political fallout continues. But yeah, I think still at this point, there's a lot of confusion, a lot of chaos.
Tony, in Milwaukee, he says that he's going to be changing his original speech, Donald Trump, and saying something different. Do you have any intel on that and what the direction of travel is on that?
Yeah, we haven't seen the speech yet, but we do have some idea. I mean, he put out a statement yesterday, the day after the attack happened, in which he called for unity. He thanked God that he was still alive. He said that Americans need to come together and defeat evil. And we think that is likely to be the theme of his speech this week at the convention, which is a message of unity and of trying to bring people together. That is a big change from his previous strategy, which I think it's fair to say has always been quite divisive. It's been full of attacks on his opponents, on Joe Biden, on the Democrats, and on his presidential record. What we're likely to see now is him attempt to emerge as some kind of unity candidate and as someone who is kind of standing up to the forces of evil as opposed to running simply as a Republican candidate.
I mean, that could be quite a positive thing if we're thinking about how language needs to change around politics. Tony, I was talking about some of the work by Frank Luntz, the US pollster. He said in terms of the actual effect on the election, he thought there might be a bump for Trump because obviously there's going to be a huge amount of sympathy for him. But actually, he said that only 4% of the American electorate is truly undecided. One thing he did say, though, which I thought was an interesting argument, that people who do support Trump could really be motivated to come out and vote. And if you think back to 2020, although Trump lost, he actually received the second highest ever number of votes for a presidential candidate. He was beaten by the person who received the most ever votes for a presidential candidate, Joe Biden, in the same election. So if his supporters are now motivated, Trump supporters are now motivated by this horrific attempt on his life, whereas, of course, Joe Biden, the question marks over his suitability to be candidate amongst Democrats could soften the turnout for him. So although it may not change minds, it may change turnout.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Turnout is obviously a huge issue in all elections, and there is a fair proportion of Republican voters, of registered Republicans who don't fall into that 4% undecided bracket, who have been quite skeptical about the idea of voting for Donald Trump. We think about the sort of people perhaps who backed Nikki Haley during the Republican primaries. There is a fairly small proportion, but there is a proportion of these Republican never-Trumpers who are perhaps what you think of as sort of more Reaganite Republicans, establishment Republicans, who have always been quite skeptical of Donald Trump as what they see as a populist figure in a party which has always had a kind of core establishment to it. So yeah, it's possible that those people might feel motivated to go out and vote for Trump. And as you say, there are these ongoing questions over Joe Biden, and that middle proportion of voters, and indeed some Democrats, are very skeptical of their own candidate now. So I think we probably will see a bump for Trump in the polls. I mean, if you look at what happened after Ronald Reagan was shot in 1981, he was shot in March 1981, just after he took over the presidency. He saw an 8% boost in the short run for the next few months in his poll ratings. And I think there will also be some impact as to the way that the discourse changes in the next few months, because we did have the Biden campaign on the back foot, campaigning against what they said it was Project 2025. They call it this Trump agenda. The discourse on both sides and the rhetoric was quite aggressive. The Biden campaign has now suspended a lot of its TV ads. It's suspended a lot of its communications, and it's going to stop launching those kinds of attacks on Trump in light of what's happened. Now, if that strategy that the Biden campaign had launched was going to work, and that it was going to bring some of these people over, clearly it will have an impact if they now stop doing it. So it's difficult to work out what exactly will happen, because of course it depends on what the big players actually do now. But I think it is hard to see in purely political terms this is anything other than a good thing for the Trump campaign, even if on a personal level and on a wider point about the American political landscape and political discourse, it's a pretty horrifying story.
Tony, where there's a major news event, there's always a conspiracy theory or five. We certainly don't want to be jumping down that rabbit hole. But what can you tell us about Thomas Crooks, the gunman? Because he was a registered Republican member, yet at the same time I've also heard that he made a donation to Joe Biden's campaign. Is there much more in his background? Because one of the theme of the pieces today is that people are scratching their heads trying to find a motive. There's also been a conversation, by the way, about how the Secret Service handled eyewitness testimony suggesting that he was on the roof. Perhaps that's something for another podcast, but just on the shooter himself, Tony.
Yeah, I think, Camilla, we know very little about this guy at the moment. He doesn't have any social media presence. Some people have spoken to some of his classmates at school. This guy's only 20 years old, so he doesn't have a huge kind of background, and there's not that many people who know him, it seems. I think we should be very skeptical of speculating about motive at the moment, but we do have a few facts. As you point out, he's a registered Republican. He he donated $15 towards a kind of progressive cause in 2021 to a political campaign group. And people who knew him at school say that he was a relative outcast, that he didn't have that many friends at school. He was bullied. And he'd always maintained an interest in guns, which is perhaps an obvious fact given what's happened. Beyond that, we don't really know very much more. As far as we know, he didn't leave any kind of manifesto or any kind of note explaining why he was doing what he was doing. And the FBI and the other authorities will now be trying to work that out. But as you say, there's a lot of people on the internet speculating about what exactly happened here, and we should probably wait until we hear from the investigators any concrete facts that they've managed to unearth.
It's been amazing, hasn't it? Already this event has entered that kind of the annals of American history, the iconography around what happened after the shooting, the former president ducking down and then apparently whispering. I was reading our reporting this morning, whispering, "Wait, wait." And he stands back up with his blood-flecked face, puts his fist up and says, "Fight, fight, fight." Even in that moment, Trump, the person who, it must be instinct that's working there, that is able to still keep his wits about him, because you would imagine that he should just be bundled away. That the idea of him standing up again in that situation, where of course, although the sniper had then been seen and possibly had already been shot at that point, they didn't know there weren't other shooters around. It does seem incredible. And then he has that picture of his fist up with the American flag, the stars and stripes behind him, that clear blue sky. I mean, that is right up there with the most famous images of American history.
That's right. I mean, you do have to yeah, as you point out, he does have extraordinary political instincts, and it is quite extraordinary to stand up and to brave that situation right in the middle of it. He did address that in a new interview this morning. He spoke to the New York Post, in which he described it himself as an iconic image that was taken there by an Associated Press photographer. He said that most of the time, in order to get an iconic image like that, you have to die. And he was quite pleased that he'd managed to get one without dying himself. But he also spoke about how close the bullet really came. He said that normally in his speeches, he doesn't take his eyes off the crowd. He looks at the crowd all the time. But at the exact second that the rifle was fired, he turned his head to look at a screen next to him, which was displaying some statistics about immigration that he was talking about. And had he not moved his head only a couple of inches to look over to his right, that bullet would have gone straight through the back of his head. So he does project, in his words and what he's saying this morning, he's talking about being incredibly grateful to still be alive. And I think it's quite clear that he recognises the significance of that iconography and of that image.
Let's just have a word actually about that extraordinary photojournalism. It was Evan Vucci, who is the Associated Press's chief photographer, Pulitzer Prize winning, won a Pulitzer Prize, and he has said that how the image is used in public discourse is not really for him to worry about. The way I look at it is I was present and I did my job. I kept my head and told the story. Extraordinary, because parallels have been drawn between his photograph and indeed that of another AP photographer, Joe Rosenthal, who took that extraordinary picture of US Marines raising the American flag on Iwo Jima in World War II. Stunning. Also, can we have a word about Melania Trump, the lesser spotted former First Lady, and what she said on X, formerly known as Twitter, referring to the fact that that violent bullet strike could have made her life and their son Barron's life on the brink of devastating change. She says, "I'm thinking of you now, my fellow Americans. We have always been a unique union. America, the fabric of our gentle nation, is tattered, but our courage and common sense must ascend and bring us back together as one." Speaking of her husband, she says, "A monster who recognised my husband as an inhuman political machine attempted to wring out Donald's passion, his laughter, ingenuity, love of music and inspiration. The core facets of my husband's life, his human side, were buried below the political machine." Now, regardless of what people think about Donald Trump, as a politician, as a person, this bloke is a husband and he is a father.
Do you think, Tony, absolutely, Camilla, what's your judgment, Tony, on whether this will last? I mean, we mustn't forget that the toxicity of politics in America, a lot of it is down to attacks from the extremes and lots of people attacking Donald Trump for the types of things he has done. Of course, he's sat down with many, many far-right people like Nick Fuentes. He's had, very, very controversial statements around far-right nationalism in America. Of course, the white supremacist march in Charlottesville when he said there was blame on both sides. This is not for a moment, Camilla, to forget what Melania has pointed out. Of course, these things are not equal. But nevertheless, the language has been brutalized, and a lot of people would say that Donald Trump has had a role in that, or certainly, him and also those who support him. Do you think, Tony, there is any hope? I mean, my hope from this is that does Donald Trump now realise that to be presidential is to lean much more into what Melania talks about, the fabric of our gentle nation, and this idea of bringing people together? Do you think there's actually he will stay on that track, which is what he has said he will do?
Well, this is the question, isn't it, Kamal? The question is, how cynical do we be about what Donald Trump is now saying? Because, as you point out, it's a pretty significant shift of what he has been saying his entire political life. And I think it's also worth pointing out that the statements and behaviour of the people around him since that attack happened is not the same as what he himself has been saying. So Don Jr., his son, came out straight after that attack and blamed President Biden for it, said that it was Democrats on the left and the president himself making statements about Trump that had kind of incited this violence against him, said that Democrats had tried to portray Trump as literally Hitler, and that had led to this kind of violence. So, and there were also statements from J.D. Vance, who is one of the front runners to be Trump's running mate this year, in which he said similar things. And so I think we should be slightly cautious about thinking that the entire kind of MAGA Trump ecosystem is suddenly going to become a great force of political unity, because that isn't the message that we've seen so far from some of the people around him. We have got the convention this week, so we've got the opportunity to see a lot of them on the stage and try and decipher whether or not that strategy is filtered down and whether or not it's likely to last. So yeah, I think clearly this is a guy who's just been shot. He's just been attacked in an act of political violence. So we should perhaps at least listen to what his change in stance is. But as you point out, it would be very interesting to see whether or not that lasts and whether or not indeed people around him are continuing that as well.
Tony Diver, thank you very much indeed. You take care. Stay safe out there when you cover the Republican convention in Milwaukee this week, and we'll no doubt be hearing from you again.